Welcome to the Divine Renovation Podcast. While the podcast might be on hiatus right now, the Missional Leadership Podcast is just launching, and we'd love for you to check it out. And for now, here's a small sample. If you'd like to listen to the whole episode, you'll have to follow us at Missional Leadership Podcast. Enjoy.
A large chunk of the time, the challenges and the frustrations and the stresses, if you start to kind of unpack it a little bit more, a lot of the time it comes back to a self-leadership issue, and it comes back to some type of negative emotion that is driving us.
Welcome to Divine Renovation's Missional Leadership Podcast. Here's your host, Tammy LeBlanc.
Hey, Matt. Hey, Rob. Always good to see you guys again. I think our listeners may not appreciate that even though we've worked together for years, we're not actually physically located together in an office space. And in Matt's case, he's not even in the same country as us. We're getting kind of used to seeing each other on screen, but nonetheless, always a pleasure to see you.
Well, Tammy, it is good to be seen. I was reflecting on this, though. We've only met in person like once, and it was in Montreal. And that was this year. So we've worked together for several years and just meeting online. This is like, we used to make fun of people for meeting on the internet and like, oh my gosh, that's so dangerous. And now I work with a bunch of people who I met on the internet. Ironically, when I first started in the ministry, though, I was the first U.S. employee.
Yeah.
So I know we had Hannah over in the U.K., but I was the first U.S. employee. And I wasn't just in the U.S. I wasn't like along the Canadian-U.S. border. I'm buried down here in Texas. So if I didn't have Zoom, I'd never get to see y'all.
Yeah, I remember trying to figure out what does it look like to hire our first employee in the United States, right? There were so many logistics to even figure out what we needed to do to make that happen, how far we've come. And yeah, 4 years, Matt, you and I worked together before we actually met in person. Crazy.
Well, and it was weird too, because Matt, you and I had met before you started coaching Divine Renovation. So we actually met in person before, but we still went a long time after we became colleagues before we actually connected in person as well.
How the world's changed.
Yeah.
Now I see more of you than I do my children.
Okay, so guys, let's dive into today's conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about self-leadership. We talk about leadership all the time, but I feel like we talk about it more in the context sometimes of leadership teams. So today we're going to kind of address self-leadership a bit more. I'm kind of compassionate to those priests that veer away from renewal because they themselves don't see themselves as a leader. Somewhere in their lives, they've kind of come up with a definition themselves of what they think a leader is. And for whatever reasons, they've decided they don't fit that definition. And I know you guys work really hard to help them see themselves as a leader. But more specifically in this topic of self-leadership, we're going to take a look at self-awareness. So when we talk about self-awareness, I think we're talking about the being aware of their emotional world, right? And being aware of their strengths, being aware of their weaknesses, and even being aware of their blind spots. So is that kind of a fair assessment of self-leadership in terms of emotional awareness?
I'd like to jump in too, because I know Rob, I feel like, is kind of the self-leadership guru and will have a whole lot to say about this. So maybe if I'm going to weigh in at all, now's the time. Like, I got to pick my battles. But I do think one thing that's just to get clear around this idea of self-leadership too, that it can be a little bit of a misnomer, right? Like, self-leadership doesn't mean you do it alone. Self-leadership also does not mean that you have to teach yourself these. Like, you got to go at it yourself. Like, you have to do all the learning. You have to discover it, and you have to implement it yourself. So going at it alone or figuring it out on your own are not part of self-leadership. Actually, we're going to see, I think, as Rob talks more about it too, how self-leadership and team leadership, although they're kind of two sides of the same coin, they really can't be disconnected from each other. And the final thing, I think, is we've set up a structure in some of our churches where we're expecting the leader to do it alone. Mm-hmm. And we don't know how to support that or challenge that, because it seems like unless the leader wants to lead differently, there's not a lot we can do about that. So this is really about exploring for the leader the possibility of there being another way that's easier, that's more effective, that demands less of his just time, energy, and resources to do it all. It's about spreading it out, doing what you're good at, and like all the things you said, Tammy, about blind spots and strengths and weaknesses. So just want to kind of set the stage that self-leadership can need to almost be demystified a little bit too before we dive in.
Sure. Good point.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Max. It's really good distinction. It doesn't maybe seem obvious, but yeah, if you want to be really good at team leadership, you have to be good at self-leadership as part of that. And, one feeds the other to try to help kind of become a healthy leader and to lead from a healthy perspective for sure. So yeah, no. As you unpack the idea of self-leadership, there's a few different dimensions, I'd highlight. First is you have to lead yourself first before you can lead anyone else if you want to lead, effectively. And I think also, partly in the context of, what we're doing with parish renewal is so often, priests will look at their parishes and their churches and all that's going on and see the problem outside of themselves and recognize that ultimately before you change your circumstances, before you change, your parishes, before you lead towards renewal, you've got to really step in and change yourself first. And to the point that's already been made is so often we do tend to come at these things with a very narrow sense of understanding around leadership. And we have, what historically gets called the great man theory of leadership, where you're this strong type A personality that is very decisive and can step into complex situations and make decisions and make hard choices and charismatic and win everybody over to your way of understanding things. And you just kind of, you step in and lead and save the day, right? And, every hero movie kind of reinforces that some way or another. And there are some leaders that have very, kind of type A personality parts to them. But the question that we ask so often in coaching isn't, are you a leader or not? The question is, what type of a leader are you? Right? And leadership comes in so many different styles and approaches and strengths and abilities. And so when you come into this, it's not am I a leader or not? No, it's what type of leader are you? And that requires, self-leadership. Even on this call, most of us on this call have a pretty good understanding of each other's strengths and abilities. And, Matt, you've got amazing skills to kind of step in front of a stage and, lead people, and you do an amazing job speaking to large groups of people. And you've got a very decisive mind. And when we're in meetings, you're always bringing us back to what's the vision? Why are we doing this? And you've got that certain wiring about you. And, Tammy, you're very much wired around execution and next steps, and you call us back to actions, things like that, right? And so we all exhibit leadership through a different context. That's kind of the beginning point of self-leadership is I kind of know what I bring to the table, but I also know what I don't bring to the table as well.
Rob, the part about what you don't bring to the table is just as important, isn't it? Otherwise, you don't know the difference. If you don't know the difference between a strength and a weakness, it means you don't know that you have any weaknesses. You might think you're good at everything.
Yeah.
And one thing, here's an interesting thing to think about. When we think about blind spots, they're blind spots because I can't see them. They're weaknesses because I don't possess them.
Yeah.
Which comes back to team leadership at some level too. Someone has to help me see the blind spot or possess the strength for a weakness that I don't have. Otherwise, we're right back into that misnomer of self-leadership, which I have to figure out how to be good at every blind spot and not have any, and I have to be good at everything and not have any weaknesses. And both of those are impossible for one person to do. So self-leadership does have this level of humility going into it first too, doesn't it? I mean, Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great. So if you need a book starting point or anything John Maxwell wrote on leadership, I think those are good starting points on leadership. But Jim Collins mentions in his book, Good to Great, his reflection on what made these companies great. The first indicator was the leader. And it isn't the leader that you just defined, the charismatic, has an answer for everything type A. Those can get results for a time. But the sustainability, if we're going for in leadership, has some other qualities that might either escape some of those natural leaders, or those natural leaders have figured out how to possess as well. And humility is a big, big trait in self-leadership.
This has been a sample of the Divine Renovation Missional Leadership Podcast. If you like what you're hearing, follow us at the Missional Leadership Podcast. And thanks for listening.